Maxwell Lorenze.
Hello, my name is Max. This is in architectural ethnography studies social infrastructures, uncertain spaces, and domesticity through the lens of urban histories of Los Angeles towards an architecture of social infrastructure. Of the street, in the home, on social infrastructure. Deep research ethnography centered on social infrastructure, domesticity, and urbanity in Los Angeles. In design intervention as representation of an architecture of social infrastructure on a hillside in Los Angeles, on polemic stances and theory derived from and informing of it. Of consists of research books like Uncertain Space, the photo books on the table, as well as some of the diagrams behind me. In consists of the drawings as well as the model to my right. And on consists of the diagram behind me, as well as some of the theory books at the end of the table. On the street, urban history, social infrastructure, and home. My thesis really grew from a place of deep research, and specifically from my background in anthropology and sociology, ethnographic research. Two walking studies that were of 5th Street through downtown Los Angeles and Sunset Boulevard from Echo Park through Silver Lake. These walking studies were informed greatly also by the works of Ed Moshe, as well as Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. To lay out social infrastructure, a description, understanding of the spaces and foundation where social capital can develop and thrive, is a way to understand these spaces as an infrastructure in the same conversation as hard infrastructure. Bridges, roads, sewer systems. Social infrastructure as a concept has been reserved to theoretical circles, primarily the social sciences and politics. Los Angeles is a city of streets. In the way that studying a transect of a city along any singular road can give us a good perspective of that city, I think Los Angeles is an exceptional case of that. I think in Los Angeles, the idea of the city, the way that it's constructed and reconstructed, the myths, the reality of it, all happen along certain cornerstone streets, more than in broad areas, but along certain streets that are asked to do many activities from movement to cultural life, to social life, to commercial life, to storage. These same roads are both try to privilege the pedestrian and try to privilege the car, and by doing both, they become a strip. They become a space that does not work well for either one, and exceptionally that is the case with pedestrians. The reason for this is multifaceted, from the history of streetcar lines that expanded the city to our current zoning and building codes. When we look at what Los Angeles is today, if those are the standards of roads, the standards of home is a single-family, detached single-family residence, making up over 70% of housing in this city. That, along with the street infrastructure, especially seen through freeways, really paints a very real picture of what the standards are in Los Angeles. Those are wide roads that privilege the car, and an urban infrastructure that privileges a detached individualism. In an essay titled "A Shelter Against Communism," the layer of what the single family, especially suburban home, functions as is a representation of American ideology and American politics. And I think that is seen exceptionally through how suburbia manifests itself in the urban landscape. It's inefficient, it's expensive, and it's antisocial. In alteration to that idea of building, we look at something like the minimum dwelling by Deegan, and specifically looking at the collectivist reconstruction of the dwelling. What might a collective home look like? Is it where only small areas of it are private space and the broad landscape of it is shared, from the responsibilities of the home to child rearing to just social life in the home? And kind of building off that, we look at work of like Dogma, the idea of that the home is a space of life and work, and that there shouldn't be as much of an artificial delineation of the domestic work and the outside work. It's an artificial boundary that we've constructed for a variety of reasons. My definition of social infrastructure in this context, where the design intent is to construct a space that functions as a foundation and framework where social capital can develop. Social infrastructure is more than just a description or mode of understanding, but instead is a typology of built spaces, seeking to construct spaces of small moments of impromptu interaction, collective spaces of density, pedestrian-centric structures. An architecture of social infrastructure. In the home, an architecture of social infrastructure on a hillside in Los Angeles. Rainer Banham brings up in Ecology Number 2, Foothills of Los Angeles, the Architectures of the Four Ecologies, the idea that the foothills in LA are a space of test, of play, of we experiment with architecture on the hillsides. So I wanted to look at a hillside, specifically Loma Vista Place, which is center, a walk street that is from a bygone era. It is a stair street going up and over a hillside, about a third of a mile long, about 24 to 25 homes along that street. It is anecdotally, it's been described to me as it was created in the 1920s as a pedestrian connection between the electric trolleys, which ran on Glendale Boulevard, and the Pacific Electric Railway, which ran where Glendale Freeway now is. So if we look at the interface of what this space is, it isn't a solitary road. There's two stair streets that also run parallel to it. To the north, that's the Glen Street stairs, and to the south is the Three Stooges stairs. When we look at the histories of these, they're over 100 years old. They were zoned out relatively impromptu, like so much, or parceled out, like so often is the case in piecemeal. And because of that and how it was developed, there is a collection of lots that were never developed. Specifically these 15 lots that connect all three of the streets. That is where I place the design intent. The design intent asks the question, should it be the home as placed first, or should it be the street? I think that's a false dichotomy, it should be both. The idea that we can collect the idea of building the infrastructure of movement with the infrastructure of dwelling together, I think is where we could create an architecture of social infrastructure, a place where the home is a collective space and the street functions as an expanse of that and serves the home as well as the home serving the street. As we look at what this does, though it's a repeated form, that form shifts and alters as you go up the hillside with different modes of interaction and exit, creating different spaces. These spaces create different moments of small impromptu interaction and functioning, while also creating different moments of entrance and exit, creating different and unique and interesting spaces. When we look at the form itself, the form is an abstracted home. It takes from an average, a basic home, the four walls and a gable roof, something that doesn't truly exist in this form, but it creates an abstraction of a standard. And that abstraction is furthered by creating cuts and slices and alterations until you've formed a repeated form that is repeated across the site and takes note of the current parcel lots, but doesn't fall prey to it, where the street doesn't have to just fall in between it, but instead creates new forms and new spaces that the homes respond to. A way that the two work together to construct a multifunctional space. And some of the most interesting forms in the site are existing forms. This stairwell here is the existing Glen Street stairs. That's what exists in its form. And it responds to it and it functions within it. The idea isn't that it seeks to completely create radical aesthetic forms, but take from the traditional forms that we understand, the shingled roof, wood siding, but then takes moments, the areas that are painted, where you might have inferences and moments of interconnection with the outside world. Lastly, of the street, polemic stances and observation. An architecture of social infrastructure, an architecture whose priority is to function as a social infrastructure. Some of these ideas are best seen through the three theory books. I highly encourage everyone to look through them, flip through them, gather some concepts about it, but I want to bring up this drawing in particular. The idea that another layer to the collective home, that the home isn't just the individual dwelling with the shared space around it, but there's a third tier, which is that social, the public, the street, the area where movement, culture, and gathering happen outside of the home. By and large, this of, in, and on calls for deep research, a collective dwelling, a different domesticity, deep modification of housing, the street as a social infrastructure, And I know a lot of these they're future focused. They're not necessarily realistic to do right in this moment, but I believe there are ways to start constructing housing within this style, utilizing different economic structures that are available to us, public-private partnerships, modes of constructing a new idea for home in that landscape. And for the jurors, I encourage you all to get closer around the table so that we can have a conversation and discuss this further. Thank you very much. I would say more than likely I've thought about it in the current framework as a co-op, land trust, something along that line. If you look more internationally, maybe something like a Baurufen, but it wouldn't necessarily work in the same legal structure in the US. As for in responses like a derivation against like the single family, the nuclear family, single typology, I think it does become interesting, and I think there are areas where the space would need to be flexible to accommodate families of that composition. But there is a very real reality where I believe the statistic is 55 or 60% of households in the US are not a nuclear family. And although most of our housing supply is geared towards the nuclear family, it's not necessarily the majority for how people live and interact on a daily basis.
I too commend you for this setup, the sort of the lecture format, which I really appreciated in terms of also having a lot of connection of history and contemporary issues, places where you can see yourself like inserting. I think that's all really fantastic. So I hope the fact that maybe what I want, it really builds on my understanding of like I want you to continue to like I want to see the connection of the orange and the gray, for example, and it's like a really part of it is what you brought up. So to your point of like family structures, both in terms of like like you said, child rearing or other dynamics, also economics of how you pay, how you're starting to have this idea of starter home versus multi-generation, etc. I do have some friends in Berlin who like live in more of these versions of kind of co-ops owning over time. Some of them have been divorced, raising their kid in the same house in different things. One goes from the first floor up to the third floor. Like these types of things are very real, and I think that is a really interesting room in your project to speculate a bit on those dynamics, but even in the internal organization of the house. I'm super interested in the fact that yes, they might have the same form, they might use the shingles, they might use some of these things, but also even just in the view that we have right there. Some of the houses you might enter from the top, some you might, so even some of the most basic things, which other houses do it too. But how does that structure maybe the hierarchy of the living space, the cooking space, the hosting space? And I guess maybe the last thing I would put is like where like penetrations in these homes seem really interesting, because there's hardly anything more interesting than walking through a neighborhood at dusk when it's getting dark outside, the lights inside are going on, and you're able to start to have a view of these statistics that we all know. How do people live inside? What's happening there? And you could really, I think with what you've proposed, give people literally ways to kind of gaze into these different models of living. So I'm just curious if you've definitely thought about it, but you were very strategic, for example, not to, let's say, give any indication of how the curious about that positioning and also, yeah, how you would take the conversation of someone like me wanting more.
I think I would say I definitely want more. Like I don't view this as an end project. I view it as very early days of something I'm interested in.
Sure.
And I've started speculating on how space layout would work, and it's something I want to investigate further. Through like some plans and stuff, I've started to garner how entrance and exit works. I just did every like 5 meter increments to make it more uniform, because if I did any more, it would turn into about 30 or 40 floors.
Sure.
Of just different spaces.
So fascinating. This is like,
It's so, I find it fascinating
it's
as well.
coming alive would be, yeah, obviously, I'll tune in.
And then, as for the spaces, the hatching starts to reference what might be individual dwelling spaces within it, along with shared spaces. And I delineate the shared spaces both as the lighter gray and the white. The white being how I envision them as wet shared spaces, so kitchens, restrooms, things of that nature, along with communal spaces that are a little bit more standard and piecemeal throughout.
I agree with Kristen's point. The setup is fantastic. Like, who wouldn't want to deal with this issue? I will say a lot of the references feel a little old.
Yeah.
I think there's some more contemporary thinking about these issues that should be brought in. Not that I'm an expert in them, but some of these books are 40 years old at this point. And we still believe in them to a certain extent. Oh, but in order to believe it on an architectural level, I think we've got to get past what looks essentially like a small lot subdivision project.
Yes.
Which I think is a great program, but it isn't doing a great job at dealing with the kind of social aspects we deal with, because it relies entirely on the idea of land ownership. All it does is allow you to place those buildings literally right next to one another, seismic issues aside. The real success of the project from an architectural level is that you've tapped into this existing infrastructure of really interesting networks of connections in the neighborhood. And it's disrupting the normal grid work of places. I can tell that in your mind, these will generate unique spaces and interactions within the buildings that you're proposing. I don't know what those are yet, so I think I'm waiting with bated breath to hear what those are. Full stop on that. I don't really understand why they have to be that kind of generic, abstracted form. And the reason I say that isn't just an insistence like, be radical, be radical. It's almost like you're doing it to say, well, people understand them, it's going to make them comfortable, they'll buy into it, but that's a really slippery slope. Because they'll buy into things that have a backyard and distinct land ownership and all that. And it seems to me that you're trying to say we need to break down those. We should sort of start from, if that's your belief system, it seems to me you should scrap some of this idea that it needs to start with a kind of recognizable residential form.
Since I'm a fan of thing, I was going to say, the celebration of the automobile.
Yeah.
The shelf life next year. Wow. And there's a shift in the
Isn't it what?
Chris, why did you focus on the architectural form of it shaping public space? It seems like public space is still quite functional, and it doesn't operate in a broader social conceptual sense. It differentiates the method more than that. And with that, I was thinking we were discussing levels of privacy in the French Quarter in Shanghai. They still years. I look at that, I think back and kind of study the plan,
Right.
it's something quite different. And it's also going to be much more porous, much more connected to exterior and interior. And that's also connected to your public-private thing. Maximize edge. It's the edge condition is really important in your project, right? And interface between public and private, something in nature. And then of course, you're working under some interesting, you're in Los Angeles, and you're with these two Austrian boys who showed up, right? And they built the level house in 1928. Well, it came to others 22, because it's already over the century. And they built the level house, and that's the year before Bill Civil War. And they do shape behavior. They radically change, right? With domestic living in it. You might have that too. You're here in an area that has a real domestic early 20th century. A lot of those other, you might claim this is kind of the epicenter globally, right? Have to do with these two characters. And as you said to some other people, you might find out, you're aware of that you're this environment, right? Much more than Banham. You are developing in that development, maybe into a case study program. Right, we're kind of strong characters, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them are objects in unfettered nature. So we changed that a bit, right? Like the shift of the automobile with Banham, the modern discussion of purity of nature where the object is.
Yeah, as a refugee on the East Coast, I'm often asked by my old friends, how do you like it out there? And I fucking love it. They'll stop asking me. And they say, oh, but there's no like social stuff and the culture is not good in LA. I'm like, no, that's not true. There's all kinds of weird shit here. And in fact, since 2000, probably more so in New York, there's a culture being manufactured here that's no longer being manufactured. New York's become a kind of net culture importer these days. Like I even heard a joke, there's a joke, I don't know if anybody heard this one. In Brooklyn, among the young hipsters, they say, they joke that the last stop on the L train is LA. I find that hilarious. So obviously there's something going on. And one thing I can comment is for people that are briefly here, the social networks and the society, it's not immediately visible. Somehow it hasn't been made legible in architecture, the urbanism. So on the one hand, I think you are very interested in the invisible societies, logics, and that are oftentimes in friction with the kind of dumb regulatory regimes that we inherited from 100 years ago. But we're making progress because there's a lot back to here, like land trust movements and things like that. One dilemma, though, is you seem uncertain to what degree you need to move away from the private ownership of land concept, which is a hard thing to move off of because mortgages are tied to that. And all our capital flows through these logics. It's become not just an American idea, but now it's even in, say, communist China, where private ownership is antithetical to the very idea it's being simulated. So there is something about this model that has become pervasive globally during neoliberalism, and I know you're smart enough to see, well, it might be a bit naive to say, yeah, you just reject it, maybe work with it, but exactly how, who are the stakeholders, who do you need to talk to? Is the answer doing a ballot measure now and getting petitions, or talking to somebody with capital? So I think there are some very difficult questions here. I do detect a little bit of uncertainty in you about which road to take here.
I think that there is a lot of uncertainty in that regard. I think in the end, I have beliefs around if we're housing with its primary goal, which is to house and shelter and to hopefully nurture community, it inherently has to be decommodified, because if up until that point, the main goal of housing will be to treat it as an economic investment and not as an investment in people, society, and culture. But at the same hand, I also know that that is utopian, to say the least, if not just completely unrealistic to an extent. That though it's something I'm interested in and I feel for, I also think there is a need, if I was to further push this project, to try to think about ways to work within the current structures to push towards something that resembles that.
I'm gonna jump in and get in trouble. And defend, or at least suggest that the word form of the house is kind of fundamental to what David's pointing to here, which is the recognizability of a unit, of a property, of an entity. But then the way that you cut them, the way that you remove it, you subtract from them, and the brown, especially, I think the model's more successful than this, than the drawing. That you could see the model, I think you get a very different reading about this. That if we actually did a kind of, let's say, modernist box collection, we wouldn't have that ability to blur property, because it would all seem collected. So I think there's something significant formally here that is operating at a level at which there's a kind of blurring, but also a dissimulation about where the boundaries of the property are. And that, I think, really goes to this discussion and gives this project, I think, a real force and a real innovation, in that those boundaries could change over time. They may change, depending on if I have someone that's, my mother needs to live here for a while or something. So the ability to blur those boundaries while asserting them, I think, is a very powerful thing. And I don't think that that is achieved through modernist, let's say, compositional strategy. So I see this as something beyond the pole. I think it's worth looking at the model to really get into this aspect of the project that I think is also potentially planimetrically also very interesting and could be pursued. But I think at the massing level, I think it's really fascinating.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that something that was ringing in my ear from earlier was the idea that this would be acceptable to people because it refers to things they recognize as bad. And I think that's the basis of I think of the best urban design done for residential in modernism was done in New York by Andrew Wright and Clarence Stein with Radburn.
Right.
These places look
Or Bruno Taut. Bruno Taut also.
Taut was good in his early career.
Okay, but anyway, I agree.
That when it felt like something that you knew had transformed into something that you needed.
You could read that.
And in a way that nothing else could provide.
Yeah.
It was like immediately obvious to people why.
Yes.
Like Louis Mumford moves into the first Reichenstein RPA project because it's like that's what I need. That's how I want to live in the city. That was a New York time, and that was a New York solution. I think the question of that this city consistently reproduces models that don't accommodate the lives of the people or the kind of possibilities of the lives of the people. I think that in the 20s, I don't care anymore about Schindler and Neutra. I want the bungalow colonies back.
Right.
That was a typological definition that reflected the lives of the actual people living in the city in a way that Schindler and Neutra were only playing with. And so it was a great architecture. Some of them were good, some of them were pretty bad, but it was a typological movement, not a formal architecture, and that's what made it interesting.
I think it's a very good point, but he's being very timid about it. Like your comment suggests that nobody said anything about modernist forms. What we said are less conventional forms. What I meant was
we heard about Schindler and so on.
That's true.
LA.
That's true. But it seems to me that there are a lot of other architectural tools that can get at this issue.
Sure.
Transparencies, frames, implied overlaps, things that feel like there's a sense of containment, but there's also things
Sure,
that
but why
move
would they
into
be
it.
better than this?
I just think that the
Because
limited
they're-
ability of basically walls contained
Yeah.
within a singular shape is relatively limited compared to this idea of, for example, implied overlaps.
But I
But
think
the
it's entirely
overlaps, I think,
appropriate
are
that,
happening.
I think it's entirely appropriate to build on your comment, Peter, that the model is at the massing level. I don't think the point of the project is to design one of these units in, fully and really going, I mean, the bit of the plans we get, but the idea is about a thought experiment that I think you're staging the thesis as something that is not, it's not about the spectacle of that model or that building, the model of the building, but it's more about the research, the kind of, I mean, you've really done a thesis, I mean, I hope you
Right.
published
It's a real
this,
thesis.
because the content that you're dealing with and the layers of all that kind of scholarly research being presented, the setup of the round table, I think extremely successful in terms of shifting, like where does the thesis reside? Does it reside in that artifact? That's almost like an abstraction of an idea to get us to think. I think you're sort of presenting us with a call to action to say all of the architects in the room, we can all go out and start to design this and it'll look very different. And you've presented us with almost like a prototype. And I think that's really important to acknowledge here.
Yeah. 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 Roof.
Really naive. That's just it. I really put a work in here. And then I'm gonna go to work. Things I'm interested in. I can't do my own notions. And I know the roof is actually connected to this is the rental school. And the fact that I've identified the singularity of the result. Also direct reference to this work a lot. That's what I'm talking about.
No, I got it. I got it.
Find out if we
Yeah.
go back. Been there, done that. But again, your notion of collective, it seems like the group is, yeah, now we're gonna talk about it, it won't happen in your project, but strategically, there's design things with different levels of organizational connectivity. And the roof for me is the macro, because the roof is really connected to the whole thing. It's useful. Now, it's personally, it comes with some sort of an idea connected to that project. So you start with a broader notion. Single elements. And then given the eccentricity of the site, it's brilliant. You have mining organizations that can adapt a highly complex global market. This is what you do plan. And we've done that. You definitely saw it within your terms. I would not argue just the terms, but I'd go back to like the space, there's some sort of meaning that you understand that is the project.
Yeah.
You want the space, not the building. You're still, I think we incredibly object oriented. I think keep repeating these things as objects. And you're listening to it, it's not about objects, it's about the collective space. Agreed.
And I agree, I think it's right that Marshall sort of, and I was guilty in the beginning of like wanting to go inside, just of how you set us up and like what the next thing seems like it would be, but it's fair to say that this is a representation of like the primary idea and how you want to go there, but I don't know, I think I'm somewhere in between, I have to say, because even if you say like bungalow community or things like that, all of those things imply the designing of the community space in between the houses. And so that, I think, even at the idea level, even if we weren't gonna go inside, all of these edges are straight on, like, they're lining up and they're, for the most part, solid, right? And yes, we know we haven't gotten to the entire and the penetrations are just hinted towards. I could take all that, but even like a simple I mean, now I'm really gonna go old school, but like someone like Herman Hertzberger or something, the idea that like the corridor, like giving just one more foot in the exterior where people put their shoes on, where people put their plants, like that's a minor gesture, but we see it in some of your images, in your forgotten stairways, people planting the thing. So I do think that from my point of view, there still should be, even at this idea level, some hinting of that surface, and that surface being less about the surface of a bunch of units, but something that could creep in, creep out, and you would begin to kind of hint at maybe how it doesn't become interior, but how the red starts to become increasingly interior.
I think personally for like where the project was at, it made sense to keep it as more of the form per se.
Sure.
But I do completely agree. Like I want more out of it. I want to really delve into what the interiors could look like. What do the roofs actually look like in functionality? What do some of these spaces that kind of break up that monotony look like? How does it further break up the form? I think these are things that I would like to push the project for future. Like I'm really enjoying this conversation of what could that look like? What could these forms look like? That was just, I'm just still working towards that.
I think about like how much I think we use sure, I want to echo the comments about this circulation as you develop, you know, that vision for us. I had the life experience of working on this. I mean, there were just so many ways of getting you would actually like not rent that network is so so I think as it developed, you see these ramps and narrow staircases. I think that it's in your prototype.
Well, I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate Max and thank you all for this conversation. Right now, I see him taking notes, that's a good sign. And just one kind of little personal comment, I think maybe the elephant in the room that I know Max chatted about is part of his attitude towards the earth form or something more typical really is ultimately going to find itself, and to come back to Schindler, in how you will construct and how you will build today. Because otherwise, we're just talking about a kind of postmodern construction of like, this is what I want, this is what I want the interiors, and then however it gets built, it gets built. But I think that thinking about construction today, especially in a circular economy, in a complex topography, with collective potential financing, these all become, I think, really interesting problems in and of themselves. It will probably impact, just like the level house and so forth, will impact the interior and kind of social. So it's not just a desire, an internal desire, I want people to live differently or live this way, but the construction system itself can start to enable that and respond to other conditions, externalities as well. So now that you have a full stack of things to do in your notebook, we will let you go, and thank you for a really incredible presentation and sharing your work with us today.